Willie, we're now in the second winter of COVID, and before we look more specifically at the UK, for the industry in general, I mean, how far through the crisis are we?
Well, I think we're through the worst of it. There's definite signs of improvement. Cargo, as you know, is already operating above pre-crisis levels. It's about 9% up. If we look at September, the latest figures we have, you see that continuing trend of domestic markets recovering much more strongly than international. So domestic was operating at about 75% of pre-crisis, whereas the international was only at about 40%. And if we look to the full year, we're projecting domestic actually being at 75%. And that's a mix. You see some domestic markets actually be above where they were in 2019, and others like Australia, because of the border closures, are significantly below. But international travel for the year 2021, we're predicting will be around 22% of pre-crisis. The year to date up to the end of September was at 19.8%. So, not very impressive. But I think the signs are definitely more positive. And next year, we would expect domestic markets to fully recover. International still lagging. At the moment, we're forecasting it to be at about 44% of 2019. But to be honest, I think that will be updated. Personally, I think that's a little bit pessimistic. We're certainly encouraged by recent developments.
And of those, of course, how important is the reopening of transatlantic in that, and actually all routes into the many routes into the US?
Yeah, I think for European airlines, transatlantic was very important. As you know, it represents about 16% of international passenger revenues, or it did in 2019 for European airlines. So it's a very big segment. And I think it also sends a strong signal to other parts of the world that haven't reopened their borders. And of course, for UK airlines, it's very important. In fact, I was just looking at, my former colleagues in IAG. For the first 9 months of this year, they carried 928,000 passengers on their North American business, 928. That's less than they carried in December of 2019. It just shows you, how important the market is for European airlines, and particularly UK. You look at BA and Virgin, very, very important developments. So I think great news for the industry in the UK.
And for UK airlines, do you think the UK has been sort of on a par with other operators in Europe, or is it lagging? Or
no, it's definitely lagging, and I think it's a combination of two factors. A very small domestic market. So as we've said, domestic has been recovering faster than international. And the second problem, which is down to government policy, the restrictions that the UK government had in place with their ridiculous traffic light, although I've never seen a traffic light with 5 or 6 colours on it, and the continued cost of testing. So although we've seen it reduce from the requirement to have PCR testing to antigen, it's still a barrier to travel. So I think we've had overly restrictive measures in place in the UK for far too long, and that's definitely slowed down the recovery. And we can see that I'm sure everybody looks at the Eurocontrol data. The figures I normally talk about at IAS are about passengers, or cargo, but Eurocontrol looks at flights. And if you look at the most recent data up to up until today, in effect, as a network, the UK has fallen from number 1 to number 4. So it used to be the busiest, and this involves flights landing, taking off, and overflying the UK. So it's gone from number 1 to number 4. It now lags behind Germany, Spain, France. And the most significant development, actually, I thought, was Turkey, where the UK used to have twice the number of flights as Turkey. They're now only 7% ahead of Turkey. So they've fallen well behind our counterparts in Europe. In fact, they've lost ground to 38 of the other 40 countries that Eurocontrol measures. So you can see definitely lagging behind. And as I said, I think principal reason for that is the UK government policy in relation to travel.
And we'll be hearing from the UK Aviation Minister shortly. So, I mean, what would your message be to him in terms of how the UK should approach its COVID travel policy?
Well, I've been very critical of the government in the UK because they have more data probably than anybody else, but they seem to be ignoring it. So all of the data that they've released in relation to testing of people who have arrived in the UK, and you've probably heard me comment on this, since the 25th of February to the end of September, over 9.1 million PCR tests, 5.5 million people, but they had to do 9.1 million PCR tests. And the positivity rate of that 9.1 million was 0.8%. At the very same time, and again for PCR tests in the UK, in the general population, the positivity rate was over 7%. So, the risk is not from aviation, and that's been clear from the evidence that we have. So, I wouldn't mind if all of this expense was actually helping the industry. But to force people to buy expensive PCR tests for no good reason, and particularly when you consider that less than 1%, in fact, I think less than half of 1% of those PCR tests have actually been sequenced, which was the main reason the government said they needed PCRs rather than antigen. So, the transport Department for Transport, I think, has had little influence over government policy, and that's disappointing. I think the policy decisions have definitely been taken in other parts of government. So I think the Department for Transport needs to be more vocal in defending the industry and has a job to do to ensure that other parts of government understand the critical contribution that aviation makes, which I think has been taken for granted in the UK for far too long.
Whilst we're talking about the UK, and as you know better than anyone, it's difficult to talk about the UK without talking about Heathrow. And obviously, we've seen the proposals around the increasing of airport charges there. The CAA currently considering those options now. I mean, it is difficult. There is less traffic. We still need infrastructure. Do you think airport charges, is it realistic that they won't go up?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's realistic to argue that they could go down. I think there's too much focus on the passenger number. So if you look at, what goes on behind the calculation of airport charges in the regulated environment in Heathrow. So there are four major parts to that. There's the operating expenses, OPEX, commercial revenues, passenger numbers, and the weighted average cost of capital. Now, the OPEX should have significantly reduced. Heathrow makes big claims around how they've restructured their cost base. They should have generated great efficiencies through the Q6 regulatory period. They don't appear to be taking any of that into account going forward. Commercial revenues, I think they're very, very conservative. And the area where they're, I think, way out of line with general opinion is where the passenger numbers will be going forward. So, we've talked about it recovering, but the basis of their submissions, where they've argued that they should have a 90% increase in charges, it looks at the worst possible case scenario for all four of these factors. So, if passenger numbers are down, we've got to look at how quickly will they recover. But we've also got to look at the other issues. What's the operating expenses at Heathrow? And to be honest, why aren't they lower? What's the commercial revenue? Why aren't the revenues higher? And then the weighted average cost of capital, which is always a technical debate, but in my opinion, should be significantly lower than the regulator has previously allowed. So when you look at all of these factors, you can make a strong case that not only should airport charges not go up, but in fact, I think you could argue that they could come down and Heathrow could continue to be fully financeable. And I have to give great credit to both BA and Virgin, to Shai and to Sean. They gave a fantastic presentation to the CAA a couple of weeks ago. And I'm sure both of them will be equally vocal when it comes to this issue. So we've got to, from an airline point of view, we have got to take a strong position in relation to Heathrow charges. because it's already, as everybody knows, the most expensive airport in Europe. And given that 30% of the passengers through Heathrow are transit passengers, they have an option to go somewhere else. So we risk actually shooting everybody in the foot here, by pushing up the charges to such a high level that you're actually pushing people away from Heathrow, which will undermine significantly the recovery of the industry in the UK.
Another recent issue and development in the UK has been air passenger duty, and we saw some slightly mixed approach in that, I guess, in terms of reducing the levels on domestic and increasing on long haul. Can you sort of make sense of that?
I've never been able to make sense of APD. Going back to when it was introduced back in, when was it, in November 94, to Gordon Brown. And I can remember, because I was actually sitting at an IATA Board of Governors meeting in Geneva when Gordon Brown announced in December 2006 that he was going to double APD. And he said the reason behind this was for environmental purposes. And I can remember actually talking to the members of the Board of Governors saying, we've got to take a strong position on this, because if we don't, we're going to see these taxes increase significantly. We now have the highest air passenger duty in the world. It is a pure revenue raising exercise. I was talking at the Transport Select Committee recently, and I pointed out that in 2011, Justine Greening, who was the then Secretary of State for Transport, at least was honest and admitted that APD was just about raising revenue for the Exchequer. So, we can't allow politicians to try and con people and say this is for environmental reasons, because we know in the industry it's not. Not a single penny goes to improving the environmental performance of the industry. So I think we've got to continue to push hard against APD. This fight is not over. We've got to persist, and we've got to continue to argue that air passenger duty is a tax on doing business in the UK. And at a time when, the UK government is talking about global Britain and doing trade with all of these countries around the world, particularly some of the ultra long haul destinations, I think it's ridiculous that the government increases air passenger duty the way they have.
I mean, it is going to be difficult though, isn't it? Because tax in this environment, and especially with the targets which are being set in terms of meeting environmental goals, is it realistic to think that aviation isn't going to be taxed in an environmental way, one way or another?
Yeah, I think it's, I think we have to push against taxes, because taxes don't have any direct environmental benefit. If people could demonstrate that it did, the research that I recall into air passenger duty said it would have a marginal impact on the number of passengers traveling. But, it wouldn't reduce passenger numbers to the extent that flights wouldn't operate. And this is what makes it ridiculous. So what they're saying is that, the airplane will still fly, but there'll be fewer people on board the airplane. And that therefore doesn't improve the environment. It makes it worse. The energy efficiency is reduced as a result of that rather than improved. And I think what we've got to do is push to ensure that we get government policy decisions that will genuinely help to improve the environment. Hence the reason, at IATA, we have pushed strongly for support for the development of sustainable aviation fuels, because that will have a direct environmental benefit. And we all know that it is going to cost the industry. SAF is currently about 3 times the price of kerosene. So we need to see greater levels of production to bring the unit cost down. And we need to see this done, as quickly as possible, so that we can start to have a, real impact on the net effect that aviation has on the environment.
So if there was one action that you'd like to see the government do in this area, what would it be?
Yeah, it is in relation to support for sustainable aviation fuels. And I think, to be fair, the UK government is probably ahead of the pack. Not necessarily the leader, but, is certainly making more progress with the support that they have announced. Because what we need is we need to de-risk investment in the production of sustainable aviation fuels. And this is a real win-win, because if we can get this going at a significant level, it can be done at scale, which will generate jobs in the UK. It will reduce the import of fuel into the UK, improving energy independence. So it's a real positive for the UK economy and a real positive for the environment. So I think when looking at aviation, the best thing that the government can do at this stage is to work with the industry, work with the airlines, who I think are doing a great job, particularly in the UK, to start getting greater scale of production of sustainable aviation fuels. And what we've got to avoid, everybody knows Heathrow's not a great friend of mine, but Heathrow's calling for mandating airlines to buy sustainable aviation fuel. And that's complete nonsense, because why should you mandate an airline to buy something that isn't available? What we should be doing is mandating fuel companies to produce it. So I think Heathrow needs to understand what's behind this, rather than coming out with these gestures, pretending that they're doing everything they can to improve the environment. Arguing that airlines should be mandated to buy something when airlines can't physically buy the product at the moment is the wrong way to approach this problem.
Willie, thank you for your time and your thoughts, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.